Welcome back to the Director's Chair. This is our weekly live stream forum in which we endeavor to explore the intersection of the crafts of leadership and creativity. So in some recent sessions, we've looked at, and those of you who've been with us, we've looked at storytelling as a practical tool in casting a vision. We've looked at leadership as theater and what we can learn from a study of the stage. We've looked at creative demonstrations of leadership in film, and also explored how we as leaders can sharpen our creative edge, kind of fulfill our responsibility in bringing out the creative energy of our teams, which is something we'll talk about today. And a common thread throughout all of our discussions has been an exploration of the traits that the most creative leaders have and have developed over time, and which we spent time discussing in detail on our last session. We looked at the traits of curiosity, optimism, comfort with candor, and providing constructive feedback, which is necessary, as Laura pointed out, for human development as well. We looked at comfort with tension as well, and the importance of leveraging this in the creative process, which I think we'll touch on today as well. Inclusivity and creating a safe place to explore and to create, and courage and resilience. And through our organic discussion, we also began developing a bit of a reading list last time as well. Two titles of which stood out. The Best and the Brightest, centered around JFK's cabinet. I think this was by journalist David Halberstam. And also Team of Rivals on Lincoln's cabinet as well, which is, I've heard, is a very good read. Brian, I haven't actually read it myself, but I'm going to add it to the shelf here. But a common theme here being, of course, teams, and on some level, the importance of a strong team in the creative process. So today we're going to build on our discussion from last week on the traits of highly creative leaders to talk about the characteristics of some of the most creative teams. The question being sort of, can we engineer in a highly intentional way creative teams and creative environments? What are sort of the recipes for that? We know what we need to do in managing ourselves as leaders to bring out our own creativity, but how do we create the conditions and assemble the right people to produce the most creative outcomes based upon a specific project? And as I was kind of thinking about this, I was thinking back to all of the phenomenal scenes of film, which was the subject of one of our last sessions, on seeing people bring together outstanding teams that produce an incredible result. I've been thinking one of my favorite kind of sequences in the Ocean's films where Danny Ocean kind of is tapping different people and bringing them all together to ultimately achieve a phenomenal outcome at the end. And so I always kind of love those sequences, seeing everyone to come together. But how do we do that day to day with our team? So I'll open it up here with the question being, what do leaders need to keep in mind when assembling teams or setting out to assemble teams for optimal creativity? What traits are important? Is there a process we can follow? Is it art? Is it science? Is it both? Let's kind of tackle this and dig in a little bit. So,
if you don't mind, Daniel, I'll kick in. You said something right there, and what you were talking about with the Ocean's films is what's the most important thing to a successful comedy series or sitcom or any show? Is it the writing? Is it the producer? Is it the director? Or is it just one thing? And it's that you just mentioned, a really talented cast can make anything work. You take Seinfeld, yes, the writing is terrific, obviously, but that cast can do anything with it. And for those of us who are older than, say, 35, we remember a woman named Lucille Ball, and it didn't matter what cast was around her. And after the first year of her show, the original Lucille Ball show, the writer said, we kind of got nothing, but it doesn't matter because we can give Lucille Ball the phone book. And we assembled this cast around her, and she could make anything work. So ultimately, whether it's a sitcom or a football team or any kind of team, if you get the cast right, a dinner party right, and there's a science to it, and it's called work. There's a reason why casting directors are at such a premium, because when you get the cast right, it can almost anything work.
Yeah. So the notion being, Brian, that if you get a high concentration of really talented folks into a room, some magic will happen.
It's casting.
Yeah. Good.
That's all. I think it's just all casting. And we were just talking about this team here. Now, while this is an N2 sponsored live stream, And I really mean this. I've seen a lot of movies in my life. I've directly and indirectly hired thousands of people. And what our partners and you and others have formed here is the highest concentration of talent I've ever seen in one company in my life. And that's casting. And then our challenge is, what do we do with all this talent? It's casting.
Yeah, I love that, Brian. I think as a leader, a big part of designing those teams is you need to master, I'm going to call it the art of people, right? You need to master the art of people, knowing how to maneuver them in the right place and at the right time. That's all about leadership and unlocking that creativity. Knowing how, each person thinks and how to best utilize those competencies. That's exactly what leaders do. It's almost like a continuous chess match. That you're never stagnant, and once you get these individuals in place, you're not working in a vacuum. Things are always changing, and these people might need to go someplace else, or their skill set is best utilized in another area. And you constantly have to play that game of, how am I maximizing the talent that I have? How am I assembling these people, and how am I bringing out the best in each of them and showing their significance to the group?
Right. And what always inspires me when you talk, Tom, because I find you're a very selfless person, so you can put a great cast together. And I think another mark of a great cast is there's always a really strong, straight woman or man. And to do that requires selflessness and confidence for a show or a business or a creative team to work. But ultimately, what really works is you can get the casting right, but if you have a bunch of jerks, it falls apart. But if you have people who are casted well together and they're selfless, which is what you often talk about, Tom, then you have the mix of something that can be unbeatable and more than that, fun.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
And
So
I think,
go ahead, Laura.
I was saying, I think a great leader knows, to both of your points, but Tom, you really were touching on this, and we've actually discussed this on previous conversations we've had, is a leader knows where to put someone where they are going to be able to capitalize on their raw talent, right? And then be able to develop that talent through candid feedback, through empathy, through patience, through all of these other skills. And so it's looking at this cast that you have, right? And knowing, oh, you are perfect over here. This is where you are going to be able to perform optimally. And now we can develop that talent. So I think one of the strengths of a leader that requires a great level of creativity is understanding your cast and being able to position people effectively, and helping to really optimize their natural proclivity.
Laura, Tom, as you were talking, I was kind of envisioning in my head, you sort of got this dashboard, as a leader, and you have all these different, like, really, really strong pieces. And Tom, to your point, and Laura, you just spoke to this as well. It's sort of like kind of moving those, even in a creative environment where a very small team in which you kind of have a specific outcome, you may break out into smaller groups, as you go, and kind of thinking through who's going to be best equipped to tackle challenge A versus challenge B, and who's going to work well with, person C or D. Like, seeing that broader picture, and sort of, we talked about conducting an orchestra, I think, in our last session, sort of seeing that in my head, Tom and Laura, as you were kind of talking through that, kind of moving the pieces around for optimal collaboration as well. I like that a lot.
I'll give you an example just from yesterday. So I'm in the Northeast right now. I drove from Chicago to New York, so I had 17 hours on my time. So I spent a lot of time with this company based out of New York, and this young woman I work with is building out a women's group in this really cool company. So we spent a long time, probably a couple hours yesterday, just talking about some of the events. And she's building out a calendar of events of guest speakers. And so she had a list of 12 women leaders who were expert in certain areas. So then we started turning to, why just women? And we started building, and why not a sampling of a number of really strong men within the company, including the CEO. So we spent all this time just thinking about this cast, and she'll probably spend another 12 hours just thinking about, before she even launches the group, really thinking hard and building input on this cast of speakers. Because if you get that right, you're going to start drawing more people into that, in this case, a particular women's leadership group in this company. So much thought has to be put into the casting. And then once you get that right, the writing, the ideas, everything else just starts to flow. But it's work. It's hard work.
Brian, can we take a bit of a tangent there? I love how you kind of started us out here with, like, the analogy of the cast. Are there other really great examples of like an ensemble sort of film or something that we might be familiar with that just kind of stood out and there was just an energy that we just loved as an audience, even in pop culture?
I'll start. Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. And because, yes, the writing's clever, but it's the casting, and you have the right straight women and men in that show. And to be a really strong straight woman or man, you have to be selfless and you have to be really confident to do it. So Curb Your Enthusiasm. And if you go the Odd Couple in my past, which started out as a play, I mean, the list goes on and on of when teams work together, there's a level of selflessness that just works. But what are your thoughts, guys?
Tom, Laura, any come to mind here where you just like, there's a chemistry, right? I think what I'm trying to get at is there's like, you've kind of, when there's a strong chemistry in a cast, you sense it, you feel it, you know, it's palpable, and it just kind of comes out, and really great things happen when you put them in a room together, to Brian's point.
Another example could be, I don't need to be a shill for Ozark, but the last season of Ozark, series 3, is a top 5 episode series, season 3 of any show I've ever seen in my life, and it's casting, and Laura Linney, and obviously this classically trained actress and everyone else, but the mix and the casting is just so amazing. So it's easy to write for a cast like that.
This isn't the first time, Brian, that you've mentioned something on here that has moved something on my watch or read list up a few slots. So that one's on the list for sure.
Well, I do work from time to time too. But I am I'm catching up on my shows. You know, that's a long list.
For me, are you guys hearing a reverb when I'm speaking? I just want to.
I hear you. Okay, Tom.
You sound good to me.
Okay, if something happens, let me know. One of the shows that I loved would be Sopranos, and I think that casting is absolutely. I mean, the writing was fantastic as well, but the acting with James Gandolfini playing Tony Soprano, I think, was just absolutely miraculous. At all accounts, he's an evil dude, right? He's a mob boss, but the audience falls in love with him, right? You're rooting for him, even though he's a mob boss, right? And then you juxtapose him to his wife, Carmela, Judy Falco, and she's aware of things that are going on right in the background. She knows what her husband does, doesn't have the details, but really turns a blind eye and tries to build it all about family and the kids. And of course, she loves the money, and so it's really like just. And then there's the psychologist that's a little bit quirky, and it's just an amazing job, an amazing rich talent that's all assembled together, but they're all playing these roles, assigned roles, and they're playing it to a T, and the chemistry that they're able to build off of each other is just absolutely remarkable. And in the audience, you're falling in love with these characters, even though they're maybe not the best individuals.
Can I say something about, again, this is an N2 Growth sponsored live stream, and obviously we all have great pride in our team, but one of the greatest assets of N2, and it's a tricky thing to describe to people because 96% of American citizens don't serve. So we support the military, but we really don't, unless you serve it, you really don't understand what it is. So if you think about the military, you think about the movies, but you don't think about the creativity and casting. So when I try to describe, even though I was an enlisted soldier, not an officer, when I try to describe world-class militaries, and as you know, 50% of the people at N2 Growth have served. And we represent every military academy outside the Coast Guard. Well, people don't understand when they often hear that, they don't understand that world-class militaries throughout time have been some of the most creative, I don't want to use the word enterprises, but I'm not a wordsmith always, one of the most creative pursuits in history. And ultimately, it is just about casting. And it's problem solving. And it's all those different things, because people understand as well that only a fraction of people are actually combat soldiers. The rest are all about creative teams around supporting that unit. And Tom, you've been in that. Just react to that. And you'll understand that people are putting unique creative teams together all the time. And it's not just automatons, it's a level of selflessness, there's a level of communication and creativity, and that's all casting. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about Into Growth, because I understand my bones. I also understand that I did a post the other day on higher education. The academy educations are the best in the world because all they do there is teach, period. But thoughts on, because you're a West Point graduate and a Harvard graduate as well, just react to that.
Sure. Just that last point, all they do is teach. I mean, most education facilities are teaching, but I think you mean the professors, right? The professors aren't doing research. They aren't doing anything. Their sole dedication is to the student and getting them the knowledge that they can to succeed. A lot of people don't know that. That's why I'm just kind of further tapping into that. Great point about the military and creativeness. The one thing that I always say is necessity is the mother of all invention. And so when you're in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, you name it, Marines, you're put into some serious, situations. Some might not be life-threatening, others might just be, very dangerous and physical duress, that type of a thing. And you learn to, rely on each other in those hardest of moments. You learn to be creative, to problem solve, to get yourself out of these situations. You're not following necessarily a playbook. You have standard operating procedures for sure, but you're relying a lot on your instinct and your comrades and their skill set to get you through a situation. And so while some might say, the DoD in general is not innovative because you're stuck, it's very prescribed in these SOPs. I mean, that's only to an extent. It's up to the leaders and to the teams that are assembled to use those procedures and to be creative and use a little bit of ingenuity to get themselves out of these situations. So for sure, the military, and sorry, one last point, you brought up, selflessness, right? There's absolutely, you cannot have an ego. It's very hierarchical, the military in general, but great leaders in the military don't have an ego, right? They have that rank and people below them respect that rank, but hopefully they respect that person, not just the rank. But that leader cannot have an ego whatsoever, or he or she's not going to get the best out of his men or women.
Tom, you touched on a couple of things there, and Laura, I'm curious as to your thoughts on this. But let me see if I can set this up. We've a theme of selflessness has emerged here, and Brian, you touched on that from the beginning, and how important that is. And I would argue probably even in an organically sort of creative process, probably very important too. I think even the cast that we've seen on film, you can see some of the chemistry because they tee one another up for things, right? And then sort of magic happens from there, and that's a very selfless act. But Tom, you also talked about hierarchy, right? And there's been read in multiple places that in a creative environment, a flat hierarchy is the best at producing ideas and creating an environment in which people can be open. And I'm curious, Laura, like your thoughts there on again the importance of selflessness and the importance of a flat, comfortable environment in order to produce a really creative discussion or creative outcomes as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the environment, right? Because in some types of organizations, depending on the mission, vision, values, like a military unit, you might need more hierarchy, right? That is what is going to be optimal. So I think it's really looking at the context. I think it's looking at the overall objective, and also maybe even looking at the personalities that you have and the skill sets that you have, and then understanding. I think in a lot of organizational settings, flat hierarchy, just a flat structure is probably optimal, right? Because it allows for more collaboration. The first question that you posed to kick off this conversation, Dan, was I immediately went to diversity, right? And to me, so yes, it's all about casting, but what is that cast made up of? It's made of diversity. And Tom kind of touched on this as well. So when you think of any example of a cohesive unit that's working together, it's because of their diversity. So think about an orchestra. If you remove a single section of an orchestra, you do not have the same sound. You do not have the same outcome. And so you need your violins and your violas and your cellos and your French horns, and you need all of these different units. And they're working together, but they each add a different value. They each add a different sound that then culminates in this beautiful collaboration. Think about sports teams. Players have positions for a reason. Not only are you capitalizing on an individual's skill set, but it is the diversity of the positions that then allow the team to be able to succeed. And it's the same in an organization. So, that's why we have different functions, right? But I think that when you have that cross-functional leadership, when you have that cross-functional collaboration, and importantly, when the leader knows where to cast people, right? Where they know like, hey, this person is going to be perfect at this particular role. Maybe even you build a role around this person because they're perfect for the organization, but you can't box them into something that exists. So I think in a flat organization, you can cultivate that type of culture and you can really develop that organizational structure that just optimizes everyone at the individual level and at the collective. And I think that's a cool thing to consider.
I think you're dead on. And this issue of hierarchy, and in addition to that, we're all aware, even if we have a flat organization, we are always aware of hierarchy in any relationship, whether it's a dinner party or a business meeting, and we do everything we can to create that flatness in an environment. There was something that I learned in the military. I joined the Army at 17, and how to navigate powerful figures in the room that I've used throughout my business career. For example, if you're an actor on a set, the director would be equivalent to, say, a 2-star general or above if you're Martin Scorsese. So that can be overwhelmingly, it's a creative process. But if you're dealing with Martin Scorsese and you're Brian Kibby, who somehow got a part, I have to figure out how to disagree with Martin Scorsese in a respectful way to flatten it. So when I learned the military, even as a private, I can go to a captain or even a general and say, sir or ma'am, permission to speak freely? They will always grant it. And once they say, of course, boom, you just flatten the organization. I've done that in my career in business because it's the hierarchy. If you're a CEO of a company, you're the 4-star, chief operating officer, 2 stars, you get it from there. But it doesn't matter who you are. Say, listen, can I permission to speak? I use specifically the word permission because that's what I would do if I got Martin Scorsese. Permission to speak freely, Martin Scorsese. You go, sure. Then you better say some smart things, but you got the permission. It flattens things out pretty quickly.
Brian, I think what you just dug into there, I think it's getting at so you find a way to flatten the organization, and we talked about the importance of candor last time to the creative process, and even sort of a comfort with candor as an important trait in a creative leader. Is the value there in being able to flatten things immediately? Is it so that you can create an environment where candor is acceptable, and is that important to the process as well? Is that?
And I'll say we're trying to get to a safe place. We talk a lot about trust and leadership, and if you don't have trust in leadership, nothing works in the end. So for me, with that approach, I'm trying to create. If I'm lower on the chain or wherever I might lie, I'm just trying to create a safe place. And once that safe place is established, that's where everything else happens. Candor and just you're trying to do everything you can to create a safe place.
A big part of that candor in the safe place is that team launch, right? No matter what you're doing, no matter where you are, whether you're in athletics, whether you're in the boardroom, whether you're, at your church, choir. First thing that you do is you have a team launch. Like you figure out, you get to know, you don't talk about business, you don't talk about the sports game, you talk about each other. You talk about, what influences you, what makes you happy, what are some things that you do in your spare time, you name it, right? You're getting to know each other, getting to know their strengths, getting to know their likes, their motivations, their influencers, things that matter to them. And I think that helps cultivate that safe place. I mean, if you're leading a group and you automatically jump right into the business at hand, that's not the right way to launch a team. And that candor is important, and you need to foster that from the onset, from the very beginning. If you haven't, you have an uphill climb.
So Tom, I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm working on a project right now for one of the university systems in New England. And I have a couple of interns who are working with me on that project. Now, these interns are smarter than me. One is on her way to get her master's at Brown. One is a junior or senior at NYU. And when we launched the project, they're looking at me for direction, and I had to relaunch and say, listen, are you familiar with Accenture? Are you familiar with all these other companies? Gartner, you know what they hire? They hire people exactly like you, right out of school, crazy, crazy smart, and all they're looking to do is detective work. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is to unleash your intelligence, blah, blah, blah. So my point is, if I didn't create safety there, I'd be doing the project by myself, and I'm not capable of doing it.
Yeah.
So I had to make sure that these young, smart women, they happen to be women in this case, understand how freaking smart they are, and I had to give them this. I was casting, and so I found these women, and they're casting because they're crazy smart. But I had to give them permission, and I know if I get this casting right, they're going to be my crazy smart analysts, and they're going to really help us move this project along. So it's casting, safe environment. It's all that.
Tom, Brian, I like that. Maybe let's stay on this thread for a second. Tom, I think you've made a point that if you don't get out in front of and set the stage appropriately at the outset, you're going to have an uphill battle. And it sounds like, Brian, you've made the points that creating an environment where permission is granted and a safe place from the beginning is really, really important in creating the right expectations at the outset. But are there other things that sort of make up? I mean, it all kind of starts at the beginning. If you get that right, it'll be a downhill battle. Or it'll be a downhill flow. So what other things are necessary at the outset to really set the tone properly?
If we can, at the outset, and then there's also somewhere in the middle. What happens, and this is the hard part. What happens if you get the casting wrong? How do you write out a cast member? Or in the Ozarks, how do you kill a cast member? But
we don't do that here at N2 currently.
We don't do that here. How do you write out a cast member when you have the cast wrong and still maintain the relationships? Because maybe they were right not for that show, but they're right for another show. So that's something we can move to another part of the conversation. But Dan, I just want to make sure we table that so we can come back to it. But are there other things that we have to do at launch time? And maybe you do think about that launch time. In fact, you set up as you're building trust, I'm building a cast here. And I think this is the right cast. You guys are crazy talented people. But in the event that I got it wrong, not you, I'm asking for permission to change the cast, including myself. Because you're building that safe place up front. So if someone, because I'm trying to preserve relationships, this is chess, not checkers from the movie Training Day. I'm trying to preserve those relationships if you have to make changes. So that's one of the things I might do up front. But
so the point there, Brian, being just setting the expectation that we may make a change. We may the recipe may need to adjust, whether in people or in process, and that's going to happen. So let's just acknowledge that up front.
And if it's guiding light, I may kill you off in 2021, but I may bring you back to life in 2025. Right? Who
Anything can happen on the show, right?
Anything can happen.
Laura, Tom, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, one of the first things that I think is so important to do, and this actually does kind of go back to flattening out the hierarchy. And it's also been a recurring theme throughout our conversations the last couple of weeks, is you have to establish that authenticity and that approachability from the onset, right? Because then down the road, if you need to pivot, right? Because you will, life, we have to pivot. Personally, we have to pivot. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having to redirect. But if you can cultivate that approachability and that trust and that authenticity from the get-go, it will be that much easier to make changes as necessary down the road, because you have cultivated trust and honesty and transparency as a leader with your teams, or even just, as peers. And I think that is so important to do from the very beginning. And part of that is through, just talking about, what is your favorite thing to do outside of work? What would be your favorite thing to do? What would be your perfect Saturday morning? Love them or hate them, there's a reason that a lot of team building workshops have icebreakers to begin with, right? Because it kind of gets everyone to be a little bit more relaxed. It makes the conversation more conversational, right? Not so I have to speak business right away. And I think it's also really important coming from a lens of working with people from different cultures, or honestly, people from different genders, because they're socialized differently to not speak up, And so I think that, Brian, you touched on something incredibly important, and that is giving people permission. You have permission to sit at the table. You have permission to speak up. You have permission to change your mind. I think that if you can cultivate that from the very beginning, then you have enabled someone to be their best self. And when someone feels enabled to be their best self and feels like they have permission to be whatever they are, to change, to, whatever life throws at them, whatever the organization throws at them, then you have created a team of a bunch of people who feel enabled. And that is so powerful.
To your point, Laura, it's like not just we're enabling or asking or giving someone permission to contribute, but the expectation that we need your contributions and we should come out with this. Tom, you're about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that, prior to N2 Growth, I was at McKinsey and Company. And one of the things that they did extraordinarily well was team launches, right? And so, you are on either short-term engagements, maybe 4 weeks, maybe up to 2 months, whatever it is, but you're thrown into, a room with very smart people that are all trying to get to this end goal of, providing some insight or strategy for a company or organization that you're advising. And it's, how do you get the best out of everyone? And part of that is, team norms. Like, what are going to be our team norms? And so that's where you give people permission to say, hey, I have a child, and part of my things that I want to do is I want to check in with my family every single day from 5 to 7 o'clock. That's the time for me to be with my kids, to help them with homework, to do whatever it is. And then the team understands that, they get that, and they're supportive. They're supportive of that other individual, that, listen, we have other lives outside of work. And so you create these norms at the very beginning of a team launch to make people feel comfortable, to maximize, their comfort level and their feeling that, the team cares about me, cares about things that I have going on in my life outside of, the study at hand. And so a big part of that, that team launch is creating norms. What are things that you're going to do? What are things that you're not going to do? It doesn't have to be prohibitive, but it also could be, things that you're going to try and work more on. And so a big part of that team launch and getting it right is establish norms for everyone too at year 2.
Yeah. There's a response that came in from a Dr. Jacqueline, and she uses a very powerful word. And we talk about safe, we talk about trust, we talk about giving permission, and what she talks about is vulnerability. So I think that, as we talked earlier about sitcoms and other things, when people come into that room, if they're vulnerable, that's where great things can happen too. There's something, this guy named Terry McGraw, he runs the McGraw-Hill, used to run the McGraw-Hill companies, and he's now chairman of the McGraw-Hill companies. And he said something to me, 12 years ago when he gave me some job. And he said, I'll give you one piece of advice, Brian. Never try to have all the answers, because you can't and you won't. What he really was speaking to was vulnerability, which is exactly what Dr. Jacqueline was pointing out just here.
Yeah, vulnerability is one of my absolute favorite topics. Brian, you brought up Brene Brown recently in one of these conversations, and her research is all vulnerability and empathy. So 2 of my absolute favorites. But I think that that's such a good point, because you have to let your team know that they can be vulnerable, right? Because there is so much that goes on in everyone's lives any given day, right? And so yes, you can compartmentalize. Yes, you can check it at the door to some extent, but being able to be vulnerable, that is when you can change, right? Because when you're vulnerable, you're honest with yourself and you're honest with others. And that is one of the strongest catalysts for change, especially, if we have to change course down the road, as Brian brought up.
Well, this is a bit of a tangent, but I want to follow up for a second. And Jacqueline, thank you again for bringing this up. Laura, why is it that, again, it's important, like I'll use the analogy here, Brian, we're talking about the team launch. This is the pilot episode of the show. So you got to get the pilot episode right. So why is it so important in that pilot episode at the outset that, and what is it about when a leader demonstrates vulnerability? Why is it, and is it true? And then why is it true, if it is true, that we tend to trust them more? What is it about that? And that then, of course, creates the expectation that others, the safe place for others to be vulnerable as well. But what is it about that engenders trust, or does it?
Can I, if you don't mind, let me go back to Ozark. So their pilot episode was also among the best pilots I've ever seen. And so to me, it's obviously important to have a pilot that's successful because it draws your audience in.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll take it back to my early days as a sales leader. And when I would teach other sales leaders, other heads of sales and district sales managers, I would always say, whatever you do in the first week, if you can, manufacture success for that person. Manufacture it. If you have a win that you know is going to come, give it to Laura. Manufacture it. So when I think about this issue of having a pilot, obviously in Ozark, having that initial pilot draws an audience in. But if I'm the director, the producer, I'm trying to manufacture success for that team. I'm trying to manufacture great reviews because that will inspire their best work. So that's one way to think about it.
Speaking of the importance of early wins, right?
Early wins.
For me, and vulnerability as a leader, it basically, just think like, I'll throw you on the spot, Laura. Who's one person that you're vulnerable with? Just name one. Like the main person that you're vulnerable with.
Probably my sisters.
Perfect. Right.
Yeah.
Your mom, your sister, your dad, you're the ones that are closest to you. Those are the ones where you're vulnerable to. And so when you show vulnerability in whatever outside thing it is, you're showing them your innermost feelings, right? You're becoming an open book and you're showing people deep down, what's your weak spot, right? Vulnerability, you're turning your back to them and you are exposing yourself and your biggest weaknesses, maybe even your biggest fears. And I think when you're doing that, Dan, to your question, how does that build trust? How does that vulnerability do that? And I mean, the only people that we're normally vulnerable with are the ones that are the closest to us, our family members. And so by showing this vulnerability, you are letting people on the inside to show that, hey, listen, I want to be close with you. I'm not going to let, my inner fears or whatever get in the way of progress of the team. And so I think by showing that vulnerability, you are just, you are becoming closer to an individual or the team, whatever it is, because the only other people you are vulnerable with are the ones that are the closest to you.
Yeah.
And you're very trustful to them.
Although, Tom, now I'm just sitting here going, ask me that question. Do me.
Go, Brian, who are you most vulnerable to?
Everybody.
Perfect.
And I try to be as vulnerable as I can with everybody. Now, two things happen. People can choose to use that as for arrows in their quivers. I have zero issue with telling what my strengths and weaknesses are, and fairly quickly in meetings with people, I try to make myself as vulnerable as I can, and I don't care if I'm. Hopefully, my outcome is I'm hoping to build trust in a safe environment. That I've always been on the same page. I've never tried to be the smartest person in the world. Let's just try to get to work. Yeah. But I'm also aware that if you're comfortable showing your underbelly to people, well, people might take some shots. I'm aware of that at all times, but the greater good in the end, I'm better for it because I learn more as a result. So I wasn't always that way, but starting at about maybe 38, I started saying I'm just gonna be vulnerable with anyone. I don't care. As I think it says Newcaster, I forget her name. I like her so much, it'll come to me. But she says, your message and your vulnerability, that is the message, that is the communication, that is the story. So I'm very comfortable in to showing my vulnerabilities to everybody.
The other part of that is if you look at the counterfactual, right? And if you don't show your vulnerabilities, that is a very uncomfortable spot to be in. You are basically showing that you are a Superman, Superwoman, and you can do everything. Not only does it put you in a bad spot, but then you're expected to do everything great. And when naturally you might have some weaknesses and your strengths are better suited elsewhere. And so if you're not vulnerable, there's a potential. We talk about bad casting. You could be put in the wrong role. Not only is that bad for the team, but it's bad for you, and that you're not able to excel. You're not happy. You're not in a place where you're naturally you're going to excel at. And so that vulnerability also has a flip side, and it actually brings strength to you and the team.
So let's take that. So let's say that you're the kind of person who is willing to show their vulnerability at a dinner party or a creative team or something like that. You're going to have that person potentially who's willing to take a shot, who's willing to go for the stab. But if you're comfortable with your vulnerability, then you have a foil, And now you got now perhaps a real conversation begins because you're self-deprecating. Now that person has exposed themselves and exposed their agendas. And now there's an interesting conversation that can happen because they went for you. Well, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's some sparks now. So, really good things can come from vulnerability, safety, but vulnerability. Thank you for Dr. Jacqueline for bringing that word up with us today, because that's where the secret sauce really lies.
That's good. Laura, do you have any last thoughts there on vulnerability?
I think the biggest thing about vulnerability is that it humanizes everyone in the situation, right? It humanizes the person who has let themselves be vulnerable. It humanizes the rest of the group, right? Because maybe you're thinking, oh yeah, I've been there, right? And that helps to create that trustworthiness and also just to start to make you realize, oh, this person's just a human also. And I think that's really important in team building and in leadership generally.
I think, Laura, to your point, I think what I'm distilling down from all this discussion around vulnerability is that it makes you more relatable and more accessible. And I think it also then brings you back to flattens that hierarchy that's and creates a safe place in the end. So, Brian, I would love to come back to something you alluded to earlier. We talked about the pilot episode here and how that's how important that is, and to get the casting right. What if you need to recast? And you've hopefully set those expectations up at the beginning, but you talked about what do you have to write someone out, or you have a situation where you don't have the optimal conditions or the optimal team for a creative outcome. How do you address a situation like that?
Well, courageously, and this is where throughout history, regardless of the enterprise, most people, there are two types of pain in the world. And I think I've completely made this up, but I think it's accurate. I talk about it all the time. And there's two types of pain in the world: emotional and physical. We'll avoid physical pain. We'll avoid emotional pain like the plague, because if I had an issue with a child, with one of my kids, and 3 years ago, I can conjure it back up. I'm right there back in the moment. But physical pain, we can't remember the way we're designed. So what's my point? So most people avoid the emotional pain of sometimes you have to change your entire cast. You got it wrong. And so what happens, people will avoid that emotional pain like the plague. They just won't do it. And then you have an enterprise or a team or a show or whatever the case is that's going to ultimately fail. So optimistically, if you put the work in, you got the cast right, but there will be times where you've got either a cast member wrong, or maybe you got the whole thing wrong. And so you have to have the courage to take the shots that are going to come your way, because often money is spent, reputations have been spent, and you got to have the courage to make a change. And very few people do. And when they do change a cast or a team member, it's almost always too late. So you got to have courage.
And you have to have vulnerability, right? To admit that you were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you made the right decision at that moment with the data that you had available in that very specific moment, right? Because life is very dynamic and fluid. And so I think that a lot of it also, and this goes back to kind of acceptance, right? Acceptance of self and acceptance of just the dynamism of life, is that maybe something worked for a while and it doesn't work anymore, because so much has changed. So many external and maybe internal, right? With your players, with your cast. So much has changed that you have to take a step back and you have to say, look, like maybe this was great in 2017. All of these things have changed and this isn't working anymore. And so I think it's being vulnerable and saying, all right, we have to redirect.
This is such an important issue, this issue of making cast changes, entire cast, individuals. In my advisory practice, and I'm sure others at N2 Growth would tell you, probably 70% of the conversations that we have with executives are around helping them find the courage, even at high levels, by the way, C levels. It's common, helping them find the courage to make the change, because whatever changes are needed, and they're almost always the hard changes, are people changes. It's hard. But if you don't make them, your show dies, your business dies. So that's often the hardest things, to your original point, Daniel, about doing that. You have to have the courage to do it, and then you have to have a plan as well. You can't willingly make a change. You have to. That's why there's an invention called succession planning. That's why there's an invention called networking and preserving relationships to the best possible degree that you can, so you can call upon other people. So you just can't say, "Oh, I'm a tough woman or man. I'm going to make all those hard changes." You have to have a plan for it. But once you know you have a plan for it, making some of those changes, succession planning, becomes a little easier if you have to do it.
Brian, that's a really good point, and I think we should hover on it for a second, because we've talked about courage being important to the individual kind of makeup of a creative leader. It's important, obviously, in a team environment too. But I think, Brian, you may have even made this point sort of definitively in our own pilot episode here, that creativity requires courage, right? And it probably requires courage because truly creative decisions and outcomes are going to be innovative. They might be scary. I mean, sometimes you might have to blow up the ship in many respects, and that is a scary thing. And that might be kind of low stakes. It might be high stakes. It might involve a complete redirection, and that's going to be scary to people. But courage is required in order to do that. And so if you set out on the path with the assumption or in the knowledge and the expectation that creativity is by its very nature, in a positive way, I mean this, a dangerous process, because it will shake things up if done well, that is going to require courage on everyone's part. I think it's a really, really good point.
And there is a barometer that I suspect is true. I've never spoken to a casting agent, but I suspect it's true. I say it all the time, and I've seen a lot of movies in my life. And to be effective at building hit shows or building a hit team in any enterprise, you have to be right on casting 90% of the time. And then you have a shot at being a top performer. To have a number of hits that allows you to keep your job, be a producer, not lose your investors' money, you have to be right about 80% of the time. If you're below that, then you have to do more self-reflection, and maybe you shouldn't be the director or the producer, but maybe there's another role for you. So that's okay. So if you know that you're never going to be 100% right, that gives you a safe zone to make the changes. Start falling below 80%, then maybe you need to change yourself. And that's okay too.
Yeah, that's good points.
Creativity and courage. One thing that, in order to be creative and to be creative, you're taking on risk, right? You're taking on risk for your team, for your group, for yourself, for your business, whatever it is. And I think that's where that courage comes from, is that, whenever you're being creative, you're doing something that is uncharted territory, right? By the essence of creativity, you're doing something new. Uncharted territory, there is no, number one, there's no playbook, and there's no response that has been out there before on what are, the audience, the customers, how are they going to respond to it? So it's inherently risky. And so I think a big part of, just having creativity is that courage, right? That courage to take that risk, to do something different. Sometimes it might be great. Sometimes it might be less than optimal. But that's where that creative group getting it together and constantly iterating, that if you might have gotten it wrong, you got that casting wrong, you iterate and you get that right person in there and you do it quickly, right? You see the risk and you see a repercussion and you change it real quickly. And it just, it brings me to the mind of difficult conversations, right? Casting, like difficult conversations, you want to have them as soon as possible, right? Brian, you talked about have a plan of what you're going to do next. Absolutely develop that plan. Don't spend forever on it, but you need to have those difficult conversations as early as possible, and don't let them, dwell and say, should I do it? Shouldn't I do it? You really need, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid. It's better just to get these difficult conversations, and then you might hurt people and their ego, and you might need to replace them or whatever it is, but you're better off having those difficult conversations early. So don't let that kind of sit and fester. But yeah, that was just
Tom, I love that you this is probably a better way to put it. Creativity is inherently a risky process, and that's exciting, right? I mean, safety and a safe place is important in the context of a team, and that's absolutely important. But just a completely safe place at all times is not inspiring either. If the people are inspired, I think, by the notion that there's risk and there's very substantial upside, and that little bit of danger, that hint of danger, is a very, very important thing, I think, from the outset. And they need to be sort of safe and comfortable, and recognizing that we all know that, we all appreciate that, and we're going to care for one another in this process. But we're setting out on a venture that is inherently risky, and that's exciting. and that does require courage. So
Dan, along these lines, before we run out of time, because I think I have another call to go to, and I think you guys might as well, on this issue of change. And let's say you create a dinner party or an ideation meeting for a half day, and you realize you get the cast wrong. And you could just kill the whole process if you just end it. So one technique is to change the environment. So if you start in a conference room and you realize it's not going the right way, move to the park, move to the lobby, move it to a breakfast or a dinner, so you give yourself time to regroup. But along those lines, there's different ways to make a change, and you don't necessarily have to change the cast, just change the environment, and that sort of gives us more time, gives us more room, and maybe even save a cast member.
Sure. The other thing is we're looking at change, and we're looking at it as bad too. That could be a good thing, right? Like it could be, you had the best woman or man in this position to launch the team, to be creative, to have that innovative spirit. But then that's their strength, right? That their strength was there. And like I said in the beginning, we come back to it. It's chess, right? It's dynamic environment. Things are always changing. And that person was fantastic and did amazing things for the team. But their strengths are not aligned to where we're going forward. And that's not a bad thing. They're probably happy. Great, let me go elsewhere where my strengths are best utilized. And so it's good to also, change can also have a positive aspect as well. It's not all negative.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, that's a good point, and maybe come back to this physical environment as maybe a last point as well. But Tom, I think you made a very, very good point that will be the topic of a future session as well, which is that leadership is inherently a creative process, and different points in time of growth require different types of leadership. So the right leadership for the right situation, right? And we, here at N2 Growth, we deal with a lot of very high growth situations and what leadership looks like in those and what leadership is required. And that's to your point, it's not always the same type of mindset that's necessary at different stages of growth and maturity. That's something we need to set out with at the outset. But Laura, do you have any thoughts on, so Brian took us in this direction, which is good, because I think there's a very important aspect. Does physical environment matter in the creative process?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, and I say this from a psychology standpoint, I say this from a health coaching standpoint, from a human standpoint. If you're sitting and you are losing inspiration, or you're not focused, or you're feeling unmotivated or demotivated, change your environment and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And I spend 8 hours writing on a computer on a Saturday. So I've trial and error. I know what works and what doesn't work. But also just, based on research as well. If a specific environment doesn't work for you, try something different. And this is for individuals, but also for teams and for leaders. And because different people need different things to focus, and different, for example, I cannot work in a library. I cannot have that sterile silence. Whereas some people have to have that. You put me in a coffee shop or a brewery, I can tune everything out and write for 9 hours. Whereas some people, that's a nightmare. So
creativity will happen in a brewery too.
Well, yes.
I have an article due, so can I send you to your local brewery when it opens up? If you do all my writing for me, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll crank it out in a few hours. Don't worry.
Ambiance. My dad's 85. And he was an Army sergeant for 40 years. And whenever we get together, he always makes fun of me, and my kids start laughing because he always says this. It's about the environment. And he's always saying, Brian, he loves his ambiance. And environment really matters. I put a lot of thought into not just where I'm the most creative, but what environments might be the most interesting to the people I'm working with. And I'm not opposed to lighting candles in rooms and all that kind of stuff. Whatever ambiance is helpful.
Sure. Another aspect to that environment doesn't necessarily have to be physical either. Environment could be the state of, what the room feels like. And one thing that I did it with one of my teams, which was this was when we were studying, was a really hard study where we're cranking it in a room, small conference room, and just working just really bad, and everyone's just in their computers creating slides, you name it. And one of the things I go, all right, guys, we're taking a break in 5 minutes, and so people got to a place where they could stop, and I go, all right, what are we going to do? And they're looking at me, what are we going to do? I'm like, let's play heads up. Do you ever play that heads up game?
Oh, yeah.
And so we went around, everyone played heads up, and we were all it was high pressure, everything. But for 10 minutes, we were laughing, we were doing whatever, and it just reset everything. It's just where we were at It brought energy, it brought excitement, it just changed the whole mood. And so, changing environment doesn't need to cost money and move somewhere and do an offsite. You can change the environment by doing something like lighthearted like that, or whatever it is. Be creative, right? Be creative in creating that changed environment.
Because you change your state of mind, right? Your state of being. Yeah.
Sometimes you need to reset, or continuing with our analogy that Brian started us out with, might need to do another take. Well, good. Well, guys, thank you. Let's see if we can summarize here real quick, and then we'll look forward to our next session. But this has been a good conversation. I've really enjoyed this. And so we've talked about the importance of casting and creating a creative team. And Brian, again, I really appreciate that analogy. You got to get that right. And so much time should go in on the outset, thinking through the talents you need at the table, the personalities you need at the table, how they're going to work together. You get a really great cast in the room, magic will happen. That's important. The pilot episode's important too, right? Tom, to your point, launching this whole enterprise, you've got to set the tone properly. You've got to have the right, maybe Brian, at that point, the script really then becomes important. Sort of, you're setting the stage, you're cultivating an environment of trust and expectations. You're drawing everyone in and enabling them. Laura, to your point, all very, very, very important. And then as we talked about vulnerability in that, very, very important. Approachability is something that is the outcome of that as well. We talked about the importance as we go through the process of maybe recasting, if that might be necessary, Brian. And like, how do we approach that? Courage is required throughout the entirety of the process as well. And then we talked about, of course, kind of physical environment, the set for the show. The set for the show is very, very important. And physically as well as mentally, Brian, or Tom, to your point. And sometimes you may need to do another take. So it's good.
And Daniel, can we give you a quick compliment?
Certainly.
I'm a horrible moderator. I'm an okay guest. And you do such a great job. All of that, because you have a crazy smart brain and it just works. But I would be completely miscast as, for example, the moderator here. But I'm a good guest.
I don't know about that, but I do love this cast, and this was the cast I wanted. So thank you guys for being awesome. I appreciate it.
Really fun. We'll see you guys. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Go to our next session.
See you guys.
Bye-bye now.